catch up on a few things that have been happening in the cosmos, plus catch up on what you might have missed, in fact, what you probably missed from that fascinating interview a few weeks ago with Dave Duarte. There was so much more to talk about, and we had a little bit of fun that never made it into that final episode, and I do want to show you what you missed there. But first, to start, I want to clear up two important questions, what I like to call Astrology 101, about how things in the sky really do affect us. And of course, the first question is about that supermoon that has flooded your timeline over the last week and flooded the sky with light in the last few days. So just to really address the question of what is a supermoon really, and what does it mean to me? Well, the moon has its regular cycle around the Earth, and every 13 months is at its closest to the Earth, and that's what we call a supermoon. And this particular supermoon was the closest in 60 years. And this, as you saw, the supermoon looks a little bit bigger and quite a lot brighter than a regular full moon. Astrology, though, doesn't pay that much attention to the actual physical astronomical types of cycles of the planets. Astrology was the way that we told our stories, by looking at the sky, by looking at the cycles, by looking at the different ways that we could picture our stories and record them in the sky. And we attributed various kind of archetypal ideas and symbolic ideas to the planetary cycles as they appeared to reflect our own. So something like the moon being closer or brighter wouldn't have been as important as understanding where it was in its cycle, which is really what astrologers are always concerned with all of the planets. So in a nutshell, the fact that the moon is very much brighter isn't really that important to astrology, and in the simplest analysis, the supermoon has no astrological meaning at all. But it is worth saying that the essence of astrology in ancient times was really light, that it was considered the science of light. And according to Plato, for example, it was the mathematical model for how consciousness in the form of light descended to the earthly plane from the divine plane via the various planetary movements and planetary spheres. So there's no doubt that light itself is something very important to astrology, and then maybe we should be paying attention if the moon is very much brighter than it is. Well, the moon is all about our emotional nature, and perhaps we can say that if nothing else, a supermoon causes us to look more closely at our emotional nature and hopefully, for some of us, shed a little bit of light on it. For me, since it's not really about astrology, the important thing about the supermoon and about other moons, you've heard about hunter's moons and blood moons and harvest moons, they're really all just words that are like the names of months. They are calendar words that are used to identify events in the calendar. And those ones don't relate to the moon at all, really. They just are ways of talking about the moon at a particular time. But all of those things, whether they're the symbolic things like calendar, hunter's moons and blood moons, or the physical things like the extra brightness of the moon, for me what's really important about all of that is that they draw our attention back to those natural astronomical cycles. You know, something that we've lost in the modern world is our relationship with the sky, with the stars and the moon and the planets were such an important part of our lives throughout pre-electric history that we did indeed tell our stories by looking at them and understand or sense the scale of our place in the cosmos by looking at them. We've lost a lot of that relationship. So for me, the great thing about supermoons and any other moons that people care to come up with is that they remind us about the sky. They remind us about our relationship with the sky. They cause us to look at the sky, to stay up in the middle of the night to look at the sky. And I think in the world of light-filled sky, dominated by light, electric light, and the invisibility of so much of what's really going on in the cosmos, the most important thing about the supermoon is that it made us look, and hopefully it made us remember that throughout history we've understood ourselves, understood our hearts, and told the stories of them by looking at the moon. And maybe when you looked at the moon earlier this week, maybe something emotional stirred in you, maybe memories stirred in you, maybe nostalgia stirred in you. To an astrologer, those are all the things of the moon. And if nothing else, the importance of looking at the sky is why a supermoon is such an important event. Another question that is often asked of me is whether there's a difference between astrology done in the northern hemisphere and astrology done in the southern hemisphere. And that's especially pertinent for the general astrology that we do here on air, where I'm talking to everyone at the same time. So someone wanted to know, is there a difference if they are living in the northern hemisphere? And understanding that and a little bit about what that generalized astrology is all about can be really helpful for you as you make use of those things here on TV and in your newspaper columns month on month. So here's the answer that I gave to that a little bit earlier this year. I know that astrologers very much take into account the place when we do our calculations. But the good news is that when we do large-scale calculations like that, we have techniques depending on the size of the audience. I could do specific little predictions for Cape Town if I wanted to, but mostly the methods we use for the large movements and trends in society and politics and our everyday human lives, the kind of stuff we touch on in the month ahead predictions, does not depend on place. So it doesn't matter where you are, southern or northern hemisphere, the trends and cycles that are looked at in the month ahead can work for you too. Remember, of course, astrologers are not making the claim that 1/12 of people all go through the same thing, but rather that all of us on Earth are subject to similar cycles and forces of nature, the times that we live in. All of those things affect all 7 billion of us on the planet. And an astrologer's job is really to understand how those effects can be understood with different people according to how different people's personalities work. And that's really what we're doing in the month ahead. So it's always useful to you, no matter where on the planet you are, you will find that it still has relevance for what's happening in your life in some way. So keep watching that. And we've got a new month ahead episode coming up in just 2 weeks' time. So that's another one to look out for. The other question, if you haven't heard it by now, and if you have heard the answer to it by now, apologies for that, but that's the, is it true that my star sign has changed? Of course, the zodiac has not changed and really will never change because it's an entirely human construct. So no matter how much people peer into space, you might be amazed to know that it's an entirely human construct. And the appearance of the constellation Ophiuchus that is spoken about in that fake news going around is nothing new either. So here's what actually happened. A couple of thousand years ago, people started observing the relationship between the movement of planets in the sky and what was going on Earth. So we know that they were really observing cycles and they were measuring them using the planets. But they saw it as a cause-effect relationship between the planets and Earth, not really how we see it nowadays. But the end result is the same. We can measure developments here on Earth by looking at the timing and the steps in that cycle out there in space, because they're reliable cycles that just go round and round again, like the clock on your wall. As they improved their ability to measure those cycles, astrologers needed to say where the planets were. They couldn't just say, when it's about halfway through its cycle. These are great big long cycles. So they needed to pin down positions in the sky. So they devised the constellations. They grouped the stars, gave them names that helped them understand the results of when planets in their cycles were in that position relative to the beginning. They didn't think the constellations were causing anything to happen. They named the constellations themselves and told their stories and embedded our human experience and our human history into their description of those constellations, and became one of the earliest records of that long mythological and cultural tradition that plays itself out in our lives to this very day. We know that we play out the human myths and the human archetypes relentlessly in every generation forever. And that's one of the reasons why astrology works so well, because it looks at those human cycles and human experiences in a cyclical way in relation to time, another way that we experience things. So then they used those constellations to do that. But by about 150 BC, it became apparent that it wasn't a reliable way to do things, because by about 150 BC, Greek astronomers had noticed that the positions of the stars wasn't stable, that they were gradually drifting, an effect that we now know is caused by the wobble of the Earth. So they came up with a much better plan that in fact suited better what astrology was doing. And that is, they devised a zodiac, entirely imaginary, based on the position of the sun in its cycle. Now, the sun in its cycle doesn't change. It's reliably the same over and over and over again, because the relationship between the sun and the earth doesn't change. What we call the sun cycle is really the relationship between the sun and the earth. That's not going to change. Well, I hope not. But anyway, as far as we know, that doesn't change until, the world ends. So using that cycle, they divided up the sky again into 12 different positions so that they were always able to say, it's over there, it's over there, it's over there. And over there was called Aries, and over there was called Gemini, after the constellations which they had also named in the generations before them. Because what they knew is that in the first stage of a cycle, something acts with a lot of force and initiative. The ancient people said that's like a ram, and they called that position in the sky Aries when they saw it as constellations. So even though constellations of stars were no longer involved, astronomers and astrologers, with the same thing really, in 150 BC knew that the first position in the cycle is the initiative phase. So let's call that first position of the sun's space in the sky Aries. It never changes. It's always the first 30 degrees of the sun's movement from the first day of spring. So thus the zodiac signs were named for the constellations, but they improved on them enormously. Firstly, they don't move. And secondly, because they are entirely imaginary, well, I guess the constellations are too, but you don't have to relate them to any stars, they could be divided much more mathematically. So the zodiac signs are all equal in size, which resembles what we would expect from a mathematical cycle that they were measuring, of the same cycle repeating itself year after year. And so the zodiac as we know it was born, and after about 100 to 150 years had become completely standard. The other zodiac, in a form, the original one, in a form, is still occasionally used by Western astrologers and is generally used by Eastern astrologers. But what do I mean by inner form? Well, even that zodiac was improved by the new mathematical way of measuring, although that zodiac still does move. So astrology, as I talk about it, and is largely practiced in the West, uses the imaginary zodiac that we call the Tropical Zodiac, that was born at around about 150 BC and has been in use for over 2,000 years, unchanging because it can't change. It's like saying if you have a ruler that is 30 centimeters long and has markings that say 30 centimeters or 12 inches for those of you in some places in the Northern Hemisphere, well, nothing you can do can change that ruler. You can leave it on the table for 1,000,000 years and come back and it'll still have the numbers 0 to 30, a little bit dusty, but it'll still have those numbers 0 to 30 on it. That's exactly what the zodiac is. It's a measuring tool projected onto the sky, made up by human beings, that allows us to state where planets are. Just like we could use a ruler or protractor for exactly the same kind of purpose here on Earth. And that's why the zodiac is such a beautiful invention and such a smart one, because it allows us to understand the mathematics of cycles and the relationship between ourselves and the cosmos without having to worry about any changes that happen in astronomical observations. Even if NASA did care about astronomy and spoke about constellations, it wouldn't be relevant. Let's face it, that constellation Ophiuchus is real. Of course, it's always been there. people invented it back when they invented the other, well, nowadays we'd say 87 constellations. We settled on 88 constellations in the 20th century. There were many more before that. But Ophiuchus was invented back when they all were invented, and it was always there. And it was always sitting in the position where the sun goes around. But it didn't fit into the division by 12 because the division by 12 is imaginary. It doesn't depend on what stars are really there. So, in a nutshell, there is no 13th sign. Signs are not constellations. They are artificial divisions of the sky that let us measure the relative positions of planets, and the positions of planets is really what astrologers care about, not really the positions of stars and constellations. So your sign is what it always has been, and if you go to sleep like Rip Van Winkle for 1,000,000 years and wake up, the sky will probably be unrecognizable in terms of shifting around and spinning around, but the planets will still be there, and therefore the zodiac will be there exactly like it always was, as long as the seasons are there. I mean, the climate might be changing, but the seasons are still the seasons. They are these quarters of the year. So, good news, your sign is your sign. NASA are back up to their own business, and you can trust that the same nonsense will be spread on the internet year after year. It used to be every a decade or so in newspapers. And nowadays, in the world of Facebook and the general seeming dumbing down of everyone, and where everyone seems to really want to believe anything, that kind of news spreads like a virus, and why astrologers actually have to stand up and explain to people. But it's a great opportunity to remind us what is our connection. Our connection is not really with stars and arbitrary namings of stars. Our connection is with our own earthly human experience and history and ancestry, our myths, our stories, our spirituality, our own thousands of years long story of living on this planet and learning from each other's stories. Ancient astrologers invented an unchangeable zodiac to measure the planetary cycles so that we can share our stories and learn from each other's experience and stories. That hasn't changed. Stick to the story you were born with. It's going to take you through life. Weeks ago, I was lucky enough to interview trends analyst Dave Duarte, and we spoke a lot about the relationship between technology and consciousness and the future. And if you missed that, go back on YouTube and check it out. We had such a fascinating interview. It was so fascinating and went on so long that unfortunately I had to cut out one of the most interesting aspects of our discussion. I got a lot of great feedback about that interview, and I know that you were really fascinated by Dave's input. So here is that missing clip, and you can learn a little bit more about what we discovered and what I had to teach him for once about technology of tomorrow and how it relates to our spiritual lives. Check out what we were up to. It's becoming part of the human experience. But I'll see your meditation app and raise you twice on that, because have you ever heard of an entrainment device?
No.
They're commonly known as dream machines as well. I'll have to show you one.
Yes. I know.
So this is a machine. They were popular in the early 90s originally, believe it or not. They've become quite sophisticated since then. This is a so-called dream machine or entrainment device.
Inner Pulse.
Inner Pulse is the brand of this particular one.
Yeah.
And what it does is that it generates electronic tones that it plays via sounds in your ears, and these amazing things that
yes.
really look like you are the part, which, as you can see, have LEDs on the inside, that this plugs into that as well, and the LEDs pulse at a rhythm determined by the computer in there. So the brain has this property that if there is a frequency in its environment that is within its range, it will start mimicking that frequency. That's why when you drive a car and there's lines, flashing lines in front of you, the next thing you know, you're home and you don't know how you got there. It's because of that repeated rhythm. Your brain goes into a more relaxed frequency. So this starts off at a familiar waking frequency, and then it slows down and pulls your brain along with it. because the brain operates at a variety of different frequencies. And this thing can get you to Zen monk meditation level in like 5 minutes.
What? And it works?
Works every time.
What?
So it's quite...
I'm
all surprised they never took off. Because they're a little expensive, I guess, but you can still get them.
There's so many sleep apps. It's amazing. I heard about this term this morning called wellness as a service. Is it health as a service? Something like that. But it's basically you subscribe to all of these apps and technologies, and the idea is it's a lot cheaper to invest in your health and well-being than it is to invest in getting better from sickness.
Yeah, no, that's true.
That's very cool.
Yeah, so that's a really cool thing. I mean,
so
this one,
super sleep.
I did own one in the 90s, but this is a more...
And is this a new device?
Yeah, well, I probably bought it about 10 years ago. But I have checked, this company still exists. And it's like there's a million different programs. There are programs to relax you slowly. There are programs to wake you up. They increase the brain frequency. Programs for meditation. Programs for sleep that leave you. Most of the programs pull you out at the end by increasing the frequency. And a lot of people have used this machine of mine. People have amazing experiences on it. Some people have out-of-body experiences on it, even though there's those lights flashing against your closed eyelids, just to reassure anyone. So you just pick up the flashing through your eyes.
Probably not good to use if you're epileptic or something.
No, can't be used by epileptics or anyone who's got that kind of sensitivity. But for everyone else, it does definitely work. And it also works. I mean, I taught myself how to play an incredibly difficult piece on the piano, and I'm a self-taught pianist. I don't really know the piano. By listening to this at the same time as listening to the piece played by a professional, and imagining that I could play it. Literally, I sat down on the piano and played it, just like that.
You see, we're going to learn so much about our brains. Can you imagine the whole school syllabus, graduate 5 years old?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then another thing that's also interesting that you can get is it's a game kind of called The Wild Divine, and it has a sequel as well. And that uses sensors on your hands to measure various characteristics of your heartbeat, which is not just a pulse. There are other characteristics that relate to your brain state that is measurable in your heart as well. And that controls the game. So for example, there's a scene in the game that just really struck me so much, where you have to, using the concentration of your mind alone, you've got to raise a number of rocks to get them to stand in a pile. And so you're not touching anything, you're only using your mind. And this has got sensors on your hands to sense what you're doing.
And what are you doing? Are you controlling your brain to do it?
You're looking at the screen using your willpower to lift
the rock. And are you intentionally moving the rock? And you know when you're messing up?
Completely, because if you're getting the concentration right, the rock starts rising, and then you start thinking, oh yeah, it falls down to the ground, just as if you were really doing this.
Incredible.
And me doing it, I really felt like I was really doing it. It began to become believable to me that my mind alone, with like magical powers, was controlling those rocks, and and of course it was picking up changes in my heart rhythm, in my skin temperature, that were all caused by my states of concentration. But
it's interesting, they say any sufficiently advanced technology appears as magic to the first user.
This one still appears as magic to me.
I remember the first time I wore a virtual reality headset, and I got it was a space station thing, and I get slightly woozy at heights if I go up too quickly, and it did that. You went on this elevator, and I looked down, and I lurched, and it was just the goggles and a headset, so it completely tricks the mind.
No, completely. I've got one of those virtual reality things, like put people on a roller coaster. I've had people screaming in my living room.
Amazing.
Being on this roller coaster.
Completely magic. But I mean, it's so interesting. It's something that helps us, that augments our capability to understand ourselves, to control our mindset. Why not use these things to get to the accelerated space of like biofeedback?
Well, because that's what it is. And I think with that Wild Divine game and with this inner pulse machine, they're all really they work as biofeedback. They teach you how to achieve something in your body, that eventually, hopefully, you can do without the machine.
Yeah.
So if you constantly know, if you already know what a state of deep meditation feels like, because the machine has meditated you to that point, you can much more easily get there yourself. And the question again becomes, don't depend on the machine. So remember, if you have a question about anything at all, whether it's an Astrology 101 kind of question, or even if you have a personal question about something in your own life that's unfolding in the weeks ahead, you can get in touch with me at this email address, and I will address your question on the show. You can also find me at my website, where you can send a question or make an appointment for a personal reading, find out whatever else is going on with me in my world. And join us again next week for the month ahead, which will look to be an exciting one. And in the weeks that follow, I've got an amazing interview for you. So stay tuned, and see you here on Rod Suskin's World, YouTube at noon, Cape Town TV at 7:30 p.m. on Fridays. See you there.